And I want to be clear, my concern is prospective, is with where we go from here.
Right.
The biggest thing that I found troubling from that briefing was the suggestion that, number one, they would discourage us from debating things like a War Powers Act resolution, and number two, their unwillingness to identify some point at which they would need to come to Congress to get authorization for the use of military force. I find that very troubling.
Mm-hmm. And do you hope that by supporting the War Powers resolution that Senator Kaine has offered, you can send that message legislatively?
Well, yeah. I mean, that's the whole point of the War Powers Act. It's the whole point of any resolution filed under the War Powers Act. It's why I teamed up with Bernie Sanders and a bunch of Democrats and a handful of Republicans dealing with the war in Yemen. That was an undeclared war. It's an unconstitutional war. It's a war in which I don't believe we have any interest, and yet we're fighting as a co-belligerent alongside the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia-led coalition against the Houthi rebels in a civil war half a world away. Here again, this is an issue that's neither Republican nor Democratic. It's neither liberal nor conservative. This is simply a constitutional issue, one involved with deciding which branch of government takes us to war.
Senator Graham has obviously a very different view on this. He says you and Senator Paul are wrong constitutionally on this, and that what you're pushing for is essentially to have Congress act as commander-in-chief.
That's nonsense. He's got it exactly backwards. Look, I love Lindsey Graham. He's my colleague. He's the chairman of my committee, and I love working with him. I agree with him on a number of issues. He is mistaken insofar as he has said what you just described. In no way, shape, or form is Congress pushing back on presidential use of the war power and infringement on the president's commander-in-chief power. There's naturally some tension between where the war power ends and the commander-in-chief power begins. Nonetheless, that's why we have the War Powers Act. It doesn't substantively alter or attempt really even to define a bright line distinction between one power and the other. What it does do is set up a procedural framework whereby Congress can advance debate and discussion about one power versus the other within Congress.
Are the chances of passage increasing?
I believe so. Look, we got a War Powers Act resolution passed in the last year with regard to Yemen. First time in the 45, now 46-year history of the War Powers Act that has happened. Now, that was vetoed. We failed to achieve the votes necessary to override the veto. But in this instance, I think the American people are understandably concerned about war. And keep in mind, the resolution sponsored by Senator Kaine, as he's going to amend it and as I'm going to co-sponsor it, doesn't speak to the attack that occurred a week ago Friday. It speaks rather to conduct moving forward. It speaks to whether there is any action, any military action taken against Iran, and it says that needs to be backed up either by a declaration of war or an authorization for the use of military force, or it needs to be backed up by the president's inherent Article II power to respond to an actual or imminent attack on the United States. That's not unreasonable. It's what the American people expect, and it's what the Constitution requires.
Are you out there lobbying some of your Republican colleagues to join with you on the war?
Of course, always.
Good enough for me.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Speaking of lobbying.